I'm Anita Huberman. I'm CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm also an honorary captain of the Royal Canadian Navy, appointed by our National Defense Minister. I am here from the unceded territory of our Coast Salish people, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen First Nations. Events like this simply would not happen without the support of our sponsors. Thank you so much to our community sponsor, the BC Hotel Association, our Business and International Trade Center sponsors, the law firm of Fasken, the Chambers of Commerce Group Insurance Plan, represented by SNF Benefits, and BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada. I'd like to recognize some government officials that are with us this afternoon. Member of Parliament for Surrey White Rock, Carrie Lynn Finley. MLA for Calgary Fish Creek, Richard Gottfried. City of Surrey Councillor, Stephen Pettigrew. And the Consulate General of Ireland, Frank Flood. Thank you so much for joining us. Just some instructions before we begin. All attendees are muted. I ask you to enter your questions in the chat function of our Zoom technology, and I will get to your questions after the presentations. If we're unable to respond to your questions, we'll get the answer to you afterwards. And I just wanted to also indicate before we start that Surrey is going to be the largest city in British Columbia by 2030. Surrey is an opportunity city. We have the greatest number of manufacturers that actually support the aerospace aviation sector. And in addition to supporting YVR, we also have a seat on the board of directors of the Abbotsford International Airport. And our colleague, Dr. Greg Thomas, sits on that board representing the Surrey Board of Trade. The Surrey Board of Trade is Surrey's city building business organization where we support business and bring business into the city. A third of our population is under the age of 19. And we are doing absolutely everything we can during this pandemic to identify gaps and opportunities. We're one of 9 organizations that sit on the Premier's Economic Recovery Task Force. We're part of the COVID-19 Industry Engagement Task Force with Minister Kalon for British Columbia through the Ministry of Economic Recovery, Innovation and Jobs. We have a direct line into the Prime Minister's office since last March, identifying gaps and opportunities during the pandemic to help our business community. And our business community includes our not-for-profit sector, because we're all about making Surrey a destination to live, learn, work, and play. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to indicate that the airline industry, the aviation industry is so important, not only to our nation, not only to British Columbia, but also to Surrey, where from an economic cyclical effect, they support many of our small and medium-sized businesses in addition to our manufacturing community. We need to be able to show them and find solutions, a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, to ensure that this sector gets back on track, because it's not only about passenger traffic, ladies and gentlemen, it's also about cargo traffic. It's about moving goods and moving people. So let's begin with some short presentations from each of our 5 panelists, and then we will delve into the questions. So first, my pleasure to welcome the Director of Government Relations for Local and Provincial for Air Canada, Mr. Serge Corbel. Serge, over to you.
Thank you, Anita, and thanks for the Surrey Board of Trade and for your leadership prior to the pandemic, but throughout the pandemic as well, and the work that you've done with the BC government in advising them and really guiding them towards what needs to be done for a safe reopening of our economy. And I insist on the word safe here, because this is what we are collectively looking at. And I think I won't put words in the mouth of my colleagues from airports and airlines, but I know that they will share that feeling in terms of this, the importance of safely doing it. I also want to thank the Consul General of Ireland, Frank Flood, who's with us today, is very, very active, and the MP, and also MLA Gottfried, who's even though he's from Alberta, he's taken a key leadership role on the whole aviation sector in Alberta. So I think people that are in BC should pay close attention, because he is championing this sector for obviously the province of Alberta, where he's a sitting MLA. I was looking, the title of the of today's panel is always quite interesting: the future of air transportation and charting a path forward. And we're all very determined in looking to the future and making sure that there is a future for aviation. And I won't give any state secret here by saying that there is indeed a future for the airline industry in this region, in this province, and indeed in this country. But maybe before we look to the path forward, a brief look behind us is important, and really looking at the last year, and because it's been a year now, or it's going to be a year next week that it's been a pandemic, but it's been a year since, at Air Canada anyway, we took the first steps in dealing with what was not at the time known as a pandemic, but going back to the end of January of 2020, when we had first suspended temporarily all of our flights to and from China. So that was the first step we took at that time, in terms of making sure we knew what was going on. We had seen that some of our customers were concerned. So it's been over a year for us that this now what we know as the COVID-19 pandemic has been impacting dramatically our business. But let me take a quick step back to prior to the pandemic to look at what it is that we had collectively. Air Canada was operating to 220 destinations on 6 continents from BC, and we have in YVR, one of our 3 main hubs. We had like close to 70 destinations, 26 in Canada, 20 in the US, 23 internationally. And I say that because we want to rebuild. We want to get back to what we were. And I think that when we looked at where we were at, how this was helping the Surrey Board of Trade membership, the greater Metro Vancouver economy, the provinces and the country's economy, in terms of ability to trade, to attract tourists to our country, and to fly goods in belly of aircraft. The incredible economic impact that was having is actually worth fighting for. And we say that because that's what we want to rebuild to. How long that's going to take is right now, everybody's trying to read the tea leaves. So come to this pandemic, from what I've just described to the current situation where we went, from close to 70 destinations in BC, we're now flying to about 22. We only have 4 international, 2 in the US from YVR. It's devastating. There's no other words for it. We've furloughed 20,000 employees. We've had some significant cutbacks at our company, 80% reductions in network capacity to deal with the impact of this pandemic. Our cash burn is still in the vicinity of $10 to $15 million a day. We retired 79 aircraft permanently at Air Canada. So from how we started the year 2020, having finished the most successful year in our history in 2019, to where we're at today, it's a pretty devastating impact. Worldwide, it's the same. IATA published the numbers for 2020. The industry, generally speaking, lost 118 billion dollars US in 2020. There's the capacity globally was reduced by 66%. Canada was probably higher than that because there were some countries, our neighbors to the south, where at least the domestic market was a little bit more solid than what we've seen because of all the restrictions and levels of restrictions that that existed in and then continue to exist in Canada. Just in closing, I will say that we took measures very seriously. Airlines in Canada decided to put measures in place to make sure that flying was safe. Flying is safe. We at Air Canada had introduced a Clean Care Plus, the wearing of masks, the temperature checks, the changes in service on board aircraft. All of that was taken into with having in mind the fact that we wanted to make sure that flying was safe. It is safe. There are no known cases of transmission of COVID aboard aircraft. We are now collectively, our friends at WestJet and other airlines looking at how do we reopen, how do we restart this incredible industry and everything that it brings in terms of impact on tourism and trade, and obviously the visiting of families and friends. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Serge. I'd also like to welcome MLA from Vancouver Langara, Michael Lee. He's the official opposition critic for transportation, infrastructure, and TransLink. Thank you so much for being with us, Michael. And now our next speaker is Andy Gibbons. He's the Director of Government Relations for WestJet. Andy, over to you.
Anita, thanks so much. Nice to be with everyone this afternoon. I want to thank the entire team at the Surrey Board of Trade for organizing today's panel. I love the title, Charting the Path Forward. That's what I'm going to try and focus on in my remarks. COVID has taught us a few things at WestJet. I think one of them is how much our communities depend on our investments and how critical they are to so many sectors of the economy, and also how united everyone is in recovery. And whether it's Walt or Serge or Andy or Heather, really the unity of purpose behind a safe recovery is something that is really, they haven't eliminated competitive tension, but they have brought us closer on a recovery. I want to thank Carrie Lynn Finley for attending today. Michael Lee, thank you for attending. And of course, Richard Godfrey from our backyard in Calgary. Thank you for your leadership on aviation issues. These engagements are really critical. And, British Columbia has always led within the country on aviation issues. Even though aviation is a federally regulated sector, BC has always taken a lot of pride in its aviation sector and in its airlines and in its airports. And I think, we really need that leadership in BC today more than ever. And we really need BC's voice in Ottawa at this time more than ever, because the challenges that we face are unbelievable. Before I get going, 20-second commercial. Today is WestJet's 25th anniversary. It was 25 years ago that we took our first flight from Calgary to Vancouver. We are recreating that first flight today, and everyone on that plane will have a gift of flight to give to the charity of their choice. So, on behalf of everyone in our company, thank you for supporting our company. Thank you for making it one of the best airlines in the world. And thank you for your continued patronage. That's my son. It's my son in the background. With respect to British Columbia during COVID, we have been able to preserve service in most of the cities which we served prior to COVID. And this has been extremely difficult because no flight that we operate is profitable, but we know the communities have given us a lot, and it's not our intent to pull service from communities, nor it is Air Canada's or any other company's intent. We do so as a last resort. Investing in communities is what is in our DNA. It's what's in Serge's DNA, and it makes us more sad than anyone else when this happens. With respect to British Columbia, we did conclude a pilot project with YVR, which I'm sure Andy is going to speak to at more length, which did test for rapid tests on departure. You know, this has been a very popular pilot project. I'll leave it to Andy to describe what he thinks is the importance of it long term and what it means, what it could potentially mean. But it is an example, quite frankly, of where it has been industry leading on the issues of testing and health. And we really have had to, bring governments to the table on some of these key issues, which is a bit of a regret and is quite lamentable. On vaccine clinics in British Columbia, similar to other companies, we've had 700 employees step up to volunteer for these efforts and to work in lockstep with the province. In terms of the road ahead, which is the topic for today, there are two front and center ground zero priorities for our company and its people. The first is the need for Canada to have a consistent and transparent domestic travel framework. When you look at the industry today and you look at the fact that approximately 20 million Canadians could be vaccinated by the end of Q2, we don't understand, and we continue to not understand why Canada should have 10 different travel policies. We don't control what happens in the United States with Donald Trump or Joe Biden. We don't control events in South Africa or UK, but we do control what's within our borders. So we have put it to the federal government to say, we are requesting and we are asking that you meet with the provinces and you determine some metrics or a date or some type of criteria that would signal to our industry that it's now safe to travel within our country, so that we're not trying to solve this problem in May or June. And of course, well, I'm sure Walt will state this in his comments, Q3 for our industry is unlike any other quarter. It is the majority of revenues. It is essential. July is not equal to November. So that work really does need to start today. And we are asking the provincial government of British Columbia to prioritize that work on domestic travel. So that's item number one. Item number two is that we believe Canada should have a better arrivals testing protocol in place for May 1st. And we look to the pilot project that was in place at the Calgary International Airport, which had the confidence of the Public Health Agency of Canada and had confidence of the Alberta Health Services. There are better ways to mitigate risk and manage our sector than mandatory COVID hotels. We don't believe in that policy. We understand it to be a deterrent to travel. And let's be honest, it is a successful deterrent to travel. But Canada must pivot to a safe restart. And I would, for Anita and for the leadership of the Surrey Board of Trade, I would give you a perfect example of the type of work we're looking for. And that what happened in the United Kingdom this week. The government of Boris Johnson tabled a restart plan. And as part of that restart plan, they commissioned a report that they asked experts to come forward with a plan that would be ready for review on April 12th. And they've committed to an opening on May 17th, a safe opening, not an elimination of tests, not a rescinding of public health measures, but a safe restart. And I think that's the appropriate balance. And I think that's the approach we want to see British Columbia leading on, and British Columbia playing its rightful role within the Canadian Federation. I'm probably over 5 minutes, so I'll stop there. But those are items 1 and 2, and I will add a very quick appendix, which is number 3, which is that we need to continue to focus on the cost of travel. We can't emerge from the pandemic where travel is only for the wealthy. And the government has made travel more expensive during COVID. This is the federal government. And I would like to give a shout out to Parm Sidhu from Abbotsford Airport. He is trying to create a low-cost airport in British Columbia that is going to repatriate guests from Bellingham, Washington. Remember when that was a major issue? It still is a major issue, but we need to make sure that the cost of travel, that we don't just save service in British Columbia, that we save affordable service in British Columbia. I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you so much, Andy. And our next speaker is from the Vancouver International Airport. He is the Vice President of Airport Capacity and Systems Design. Please help me welcome Andy Margolis. Andy, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you very much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you and give you a bit of an update on where we are at YVR, and also to support my airline colleagues in our very much collaborative efforts to guide the recovery of the aviation industry in British Columbia. So yeah, I mean, I support everything that Andy and Serge have said. It's been a really difficult year all round for all of us personally, but the aviation industry at large has been impacted. Probably one of the biggest impacts across many businesses across the globe. You know, reduction down to 90% at its worst, or down by 90% at its worst. And we've all had to look at resizing and layoffs of our teams, and you know, none of that is anything that any of us want to be doing. But there are plenty of positives that have come out of the last year, and I'll talk mainly from an airport perspective, but also from a collaboration perspective. I've been involved in a number of initiatives across various different recovery plans over the last year, and I've been, you know, I've worked in aviation in a few different places, and I've been really impressed and amazed by how well we've come together as an industry here in Canada to try and forge our way forward in what was a uncharted territory. None of us have ever had this level of impact to our businesses before. But we took a tact this time last year to look at how we could learn and collaborate with our partners, not just airline partners, but also academia and science, as well as the general public and the local businesses. And we started to see the writing on the wall that the recovery path wasn't something that any of us really had the map for, and we needed to start learning pretty fast to look at how we would recover. And we've particularly across Air Canada, WestJet, Toronto and Vancouver, we came together to look at how we could start collecting data across trials. And Air Canada and Toronto did an arrivals trials pilot, which was extremely informative and very comprehensive. WestJet and ourselves did a departures testing pilot, which was very much designed around collecting data and being able to provide data back to our health and government colleagues to help inform good decision making around recovery, and the things that Andy just mentioned about, you know, what are the triggers and how are we going to recover and when is that going to come in. So we very much collectively took that collaborative approach to try and find and collect data, because this was an event that none of us really knew how it was going to pan out. And that's led us to do certain things here at YVR. We've looked at 2021 as a one-year strategy. We've very much taken a different approach, and we've got a very much an action-orientated strategy for this year, and it's around investing in the right places to ensure that we are ready for recovery to support our airline partners, and also making sure we are safe, to both Andy and Serge's point. The airport is a funny place that lots of people haven't seen it since March last year, but you've gone to your grocery store and you understand the safety protocols are in place for going shopping on a daily basis. Times that by 50, and that's the amount of safety protocols we've put in place collectively as an industry, from the moment you walk through the door, around education about how you should move through the airport, how you then board. There is huge amounts of safety protocols on the aircraft itself, and we have very much looked at a layered approach to travel. So for those who need to travel right now, we are extremely safe, and I would say that the safety measures and the layered safety measures that are in place in airports and on airlines they far outstrip anything that you see generally in our day-to-day activities. So we've put a lot in there to get ready for recovery. In our strategy here at YVR, we've taken a look at what we can do in 2021, and there's some key areas that we can invest in, which is quite difficult during a high traffic period. So we are looking at our runways, our key infrastructure, our baggage systems, and doing all of those maintenance programs and resilience programs to make sure that we're ready for recovery, because that's, we need to, once science tells us we are ready and the data tells us we're ready to recover, we need to be ready. So that's very much where we're focusing. And then we are working day in and day out with our partners to make sure that we are all on the same message and that we are providing the same information to our government colleagues to help them plan. Because this is one of those times in the aviation industry, we are normally used to short-term surety and long-term uncertainty when it comes to the volumes of traffic, whether it be cargo, whether it be passengers. We're actually the other way around for the first time, where we've got short-term uncertainty and long-term certainty. And what I mean by that is we know we will recover. It's the aviation industry is a key economic driver, and it is key to the success of our region. But that changes the way in which we approach things. And what we're trying to do collectively, and it's very much industry driven at the minute, is to not waste this time whilst we haven't yet got those triggers in place for recovery, and we hope that they will be in place soon, but we need to be planning right now, and meaningful planning, so that when that trigger hits and we can turn on and passenger traffic can return for more than just essential travel, that we've already done the planning up front and we're not starting it at that point. So it's an interesting time, very challenging for our businesses, but we're doing a lot of work collectively to make sure that we can catch up on some things that are very hard during high volume periods, and make sure for everybody out there that they feel safe and happy to travel through the airports and on the airlines as part of recovery. But for me, if I was to leave you with some key messages, as far as safety is concerned, I would go to town and say we are a very, very safe industry at the moment, and we are continuing to work on that as we move forward. Integration is going to be really key as we come out of this, that we can that we're on the same page and that we are sharing information and talking with one voice, and that we need to not waste this time and make sure that collectively business, industry and government are planning so that when those triggers are hit, we're ready and we can attract people back to the airports and the airlines safely and securely, and have confidence in travel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. And now please help me welcome the chair of the BC Aviation Council, Heather Bell. Heather, over to you.
Thanks, Anita. And thank you for putting this together today. It's great to see everyone. And nice to see you again, Anita. So yes, I am the chair of the British Columbia Aviation Council, and I also retired from NAV Canada, where I was the general manager for the Vancouver Flight Information Region, responsible for all the air navigation service in the province. And our largest facility was in Surrey. So Surrey certainly holds a special place for me. With respect to BCAC, we are a member-driven organization. We have 600 paying members and 2,300 supporters. And our goal is the encouragement and support of safe and sustainable development of aviation and aerospace in British Columbia. We represent individual pilots, small air carriers, airports, flight training units, maintenance, repair, and manufacturing. So along with YVR, who we just heard from, and I'm sure everyone knows our large airport very well and loves it as much as I do, and happy to have the most beautiful airport in, I think, the world in our backyard. British Columbia is also home to 57 municipal airports. We have the largest maintenance, repair, and overhaul sector in the country, vast helicopter operations, 262 Transport Canada certified companies, and the third largest aerospace sector in Canada. So our vision at BCAC is an aviation and aerospace industry that is visible, connected, and thriving. And through the pandemic, our major goal was trying to bring all these sectors together and afford a platform for communication. And like other people have said, the level of devastation is beyond what we could ever imagine. But one of the positives is also the level of collaboration amongst all the sectors. It was just something amazing to see. So what has COVID meant to British Columbia, largely in the sector? We can say that in 2019, the aviation and aerospace industry employed over 44,000 professionals, and it contributed $12.6 billion in GDP to our provincial economy. So this once healthy industry is in very deep trouble. Prior to COVID, we saw 10 years of sustained growth. If you've been watching the chat questions there, someone brought up a question about prior to COVID, our main focus was on the human resource shortage across the industry. And now that's not our main focus anymore. So we were very worried about, having enough people across all parts of our sector. And now we have some other much bigger challenges. So we heard YVR talk about up to 90% reduction in operations. We know that the same is true at Air Canada and WestJet. So our operators are bracing for long periods of financial struggle and service impacts. And those small air operators that are critical to the ecosystem are at great risk. These are essential small businesses, but they're working in highly regulated and capital intensive industry with substantial fixed costs, and we fear that many of them may not survive this crisis and will be forced to close permanently. So this leads to our fear of some of our smaller and more remote and Indigenous communities being left without reliable transportation options and access to essential services. These air transportation services can be a lifeline, and the risks to these communities are very, very real. So our airports are at risk due to lack of revenues and the reality that travel will continue to be restricted for some time. We heard some of the other panelists say this is what we have to address. We have to lift these travel bans. We often hear our public health officer and government talking about essential travel, and we know, we all feel what essential travel might mean. But for a lot of these small communities and airports and air operators, that tourism travel is essential. It's essential to our restaurants. It's essential to our small air carriers. So airport revenues and small airline revenues are at near zero, but the cost to maintain the high level of regulatory and safety standards remain. Some of our airports have laid off 30 to 40% of their staff. The aerospace industry does not seem to be as drastically affected at this time as the aviation sector. And in some of our sectors, we're seeing a bit of growth, like in freight and mail, some cargo. On calls, Amazon is brought up a lot, medevac services. And interestingly enough, flight training also remains fairly solid at this time, but we're unsure if that's sustainable as that sector relies heavily on foreign students who are really facing difficulties in obtaining visas to enter the country. We have seen throughout COVID, we work closely with the federal government and the provincial government, and the governments have been very nimble and active under COVID in many of our responses to regulatory issues. We heard time and again from many of our members that the federal government has responded very, very quickly, much more quickly than they would have ever imagined. But those are on the regulatory issues. To date, the financial support for the sector is trivial compared to what we're seeing for support in other developed countries. And we do fear that this puts our nation at a serious medium-term competitive disadvantage. So we need to prioritize those financial efforts and double down on innovative ways and means to ensure our industry is stable and ready to respond as not only for vaccine distribution challenges, but also when travel comes back. On many of the calls and on many of the panels I sit on, we talk about travel coming back like a tsunami. And I think we can all say, yeah, we're waiting as soon as we can, we're all gonna go somewhere, which will be great for our industry if we're ready to take it on. There are some challenges with that. So I think those are the things we have to focus on. We need to get our borders open. We need to get travel started again, but we also must ensure that every sector of the industry is ready. So I look forward to the rest of the panel today. And thank you again, Anita, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Heather. And our final speaker is the CEO of the Tourism Industry Association of British Columbia. Please help me welcome Walt Judith. Walt, over to you.
Thank you, Anita. Good afternoon to you and the members of the Surrey Board of Trade, and the good work that you're doing during these very trying times. As Serge acknowledged, I echo those sentiments to be sure. I'd also like to recognize the government officials that have joined us today: Carrie Lynn Finley, Michael Lee, Richard Gottfried, and Frank Flood. Clearly, there is great interest in this topic and a great need to resolve some of the issues that we're all faced with. I also want to acknowledge, though, my colleagues that just spoke, the difficult situation described by Serge at Air Canada and Andy at WestJet, Andy at YVR, and Heather at the BC Aviation Council. For us, not seeing or hearing planes in the sky on a regular basis is of great concern to the tourism industry at large. Airplane travel is really the currency that keeps the travel and tourism industry in Canada alive. The profound lack of international visitors has virtually driven BC's visitor economy into the ground, and there are really no strong signs of recovery unless, as Heather just alluded to, we see the movement of people again, both domestically and internationally. And until we figure out ways how we can reopen borders at some point this year. In a recent McKinsey and Company article, global tourism forecasts a cumulative drop of between $3 and $8 trillion. That is before tourism expenditures return to pre-COVID-19 levels. When you think about that, that's an astounding number, especially when you consider the impact on communities, on business operators, and people that work in the tourism and travel sector. Serge alluded to this earlier as well. I was reading a report from IATA, the International Air Transport Association, that shows in 2020, the airline sector lost about 118 billion in revenue, with demand down upwards of 60% compared to 2019. But more importantly, Canada is considered an outlier when it comes to direct financial aid to the air sector, and as a consequence, it's losing market share to global carriers. Without that government support, we're at a real disadvantage as recovery gets underway in global aviation, as Heather also just alluded to. My counterparts at the national level, the Tourism Industry Association of Canada, launched what they're calling a hardest hit businesses public campaign that includes many leaders across tourism organizations and businesses from every province and territory in Canada. Air Canada and WestJet are a part of that coalition. TIAC, our partners, had a pre-budget submission that they provided to the federal government just a couple of weeks ago. And they forwarded a number of recommendations. Number one, providing immediate liquidity for the aviation sector by supporting carriers, airports, and by providing sufficient funding to government service providers such as NAVCAN and Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, establishing incentives for airlines to maintain service to remote communities, and eliminating airport ground leases. For our organization, for TIA BC, we recently delivered a pre-budget submission as well to the federal governments with similar recommendations. More specifically to the airline sector, our ask stated that we need to preserve national and regional airline services. It's paramount to the survival and rebound of the visitor economy. We recommended creating a substantial fund akin to relief measures offered to airlines in the United States and several other countries around the world. We need to assist national air carriers and by extension, the regional airlines that comprise the critical hub and spoke model of air travel. And included in the fund should be incentives for carriers to maintain regional services to remote communities. Heather spoke about this, but I can't stress this enough. I worry about the smaller airlines in BC that service rural or more remote communities and regions. They've canceled countless routes, and as a consequence, they've lost personnel, pilots, other essential workers. Many of the airports the smaller airlines fly to and in and out of are in deep trouble, especially if they're community operated. They're now facing deficits of a magnitude that's not healthy and sustainable. And in many cases, they've been left out of some of that large government relief. And of course, that has significantly hurt the tourism sector. But it's not only vital that we retain or try to support these small and rural airports for tourism, but it's also for supplies, transporting residents for work purposes, or for people that need health treatments in larger centers. So I'll leave you with this. Finally, to my understanding, the major airlines are in discussions with the federal governments about support. I don't think they're at liberty to say anything at the moment, but my federal counterparts just last week met with the Minister of Transport. He was pretty tight-lipped about that support, but as an advocacy association, we need to continue to press government to support the viability of the large and small carriers so that our industry will have the means to recover. So thank you. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Walt. And so let's move right into those questions. And if any of you have an answer, just raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to delegate to a specific person. Someone had mentioned that you just can't flip the switch. You just can't start the aviation sector. You just can't reopen the borders. You need a plan. And what kind of conversations have you been having with the federal government, which of course needs to happen with the provinces and the territories, to ensure that we are planning now and not waiting? So who can respond to that? Yes, Andy Gibbons, go ahead.
Sorry, really happy to kick that off. Anita, you're absolutely right. We do need a plan. Now, that's not the sexiest advocacy campaign ever. We need, what do we want a plan? When do we want it now? But we do need a plan. And I think particularly the fact that it is unsexy, it speaks to how much we need it. So I'll give you an example. If you accept the fact that COVID hotels are a temporary measure and expire on April 30th, basically, as an airline, we need to understand what the new policy will be in mid-March or late March, because we have to put our schedule out in the public. We need to begin to sell. We have to plan our fleet, our people, our human resources, all of these things. So, there is an urgency to that restart, to that safe restart request. And then on the domestic side, it just depends on the framework. We'd love to have a policy today. We've asked for a policy for a year, but we don't have one yet. I think the fundamental difference in the conversation that we're having right now with provinces and the federal government is the commitments that the Prime Minister made. And I'm not sure everyone's aware of this, but on January 29th, he made two very clear commitments at this, when he does his Friday press conference. He committed to reviewing the relationship between testing and quarantine. That is a significant commitment. And the second commitment he made was to a safe restart of the critical travel and tourism sector. So I think, all of us on the call who are advocates, and your members who are advocates, and yourself, we really need to make sure this is not about what industry wants or what Walt Judas's members need or what regional airports, need to survive. Where is the federal government on delivering on their commitments to the sector, on their commitments to help us rebuild safely? So that is the difference. That's the difference this time around than when we were seeking these policies, earlier in the spring or June.
And Serge, what about from Air Canada? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I'll agree with what Andy just said, because we've worked as an industry, airports, tourism organization. We've worked very, very closely in messaging that to governments in the plural. But I'll say this: the one thing that's been perhaps incredibly frustrating to us is we're not that we're discovering. We always knew that our federation is a complex one of multi-layered jurisdictional fields, health being a provincial one, the federal government having responsibility over international borders, the border with the US and other countries. So, and all of that is happening in real time. They have conversations at multiple levels. The health ministers have conversations, the transport ministers have conversation, the first ministers have conversations, the public health officers of Canada have conversations. And frankly, sometimes we're not quite sure that all these different tables that are happening, federal, provincial, territorial, are all necessarily aligned in terms of what's the end goal and how do we get to that. Slowly but surely, and going back to the comments that Andy, when he said what the Prime Minister said at the end of January, that was the first time we saw an opening in the door, where it was not completely shut. Because we know and we agree, science should be leading the way in terms of the measures we do. Data should be leading the way. Frankly, right now, it appears that maybe polling data is leading the way more so than the scientific data around COVID-19, because the testing and quarantine and that relationship between the two, the project at WestJet is doing what YVR, has been very encouraging. We did one with McMaster Health Labs at Pearson Airport. We know we don't disagree with the need to test, as long as it is not testing for the sake of testing, which is what the government of Canada is doing right now. You're tested within 72 hours before you board your flight to come back to Canada. You're tested again when you arrive. You're tested again at day 10. And all this, you still have your 14-day quarantine. It, frankly, does not make any sense. The data is there. The Pearson project and the Alberta project that the Alberta government did in collaboration with the federal government shows that we could have, because a quarantine that would be 7 days potentially, with no heightened risk to the spread of COVID in this country. So that's the data we bring to the table. That's the conversation we're having with Ottawa. But then Ottawa is having conversation with the provinces. We're having conversation with the provinces. Everybody has a different level of how comfortable they are with the risk that they're willing to take. The Atlantic provinces, for example, have basically taken a zero COVID approach. So they're basically shut down almost to the rest of the country. And so it's very complex. So to answer your first question in terms of how, that switch, and it's true, some people think that it might happen overnight, but it takes time to bring back aircraft into service. Some of those aircraft are parked outside of the country. It takes a bit of time to bring back our pilots, our flight attendants. So, the demand and the ability to meet the demand, they might be a gap there in our ability to actually meet the demand, if that demand exists, in the summer months. So the more we know about the government's plans, the better it is for us to plan, because so far we've basically learned sometimes fairly last minute of the decisions that they've made on testing, for example. And so it is imperative that eventually we can have a discussion around the key metrics that they are looking for to say we're opening a little, somewhat, or entirely, or not. And so far we have no visibility around that.
Heather and then Andy from YVR, tell me, what is your perspective on some type of global governance commitment, perhaps through the World Health Organization, on a vaccine passport, whatever that looks like? And how would that affect, even smaller communities in order to ensure economic recovery? Heather, you first.
I think as we often hear people say about the a passport, a vaccination passport, that there needs to be consistency. And Andy from WestJet talked about that before. Like we don't even have consistency across our country right now. So the idea that we're going to get global consistency is a bit of a bridge that looks like it's far away. I think it would be great, but it doesn't seem like something that we could have happen in the near term. But again, anything that helps, anything, even if it's only helping, we've talked about travel corridors, and yes, the Atlantic provinces are closed off. Anything that is a stepping stone, let's do it. Like, we're in unprecedented times. We don't know, the government seems to be stumbling sometimes on how to react to things. So, if I had a passport, the stamp that said I could go somewhere, would I go? Absolutely. Now, then I think to myself, well, I'm, going to get on an airplane and get to an airport, and they're not going to let me in because they have a different rules and regulations. But it's a step forward, and we can't let, as the old saying goes, perfection get in the way of good enough, or let's just go. We're at that time now, like, has been said, we need to have plans. We need a plan. We just need to start doing and going. It's, the end is in sight, so we need to be ready. And I fear right now that the longer we wait, the farther behind we will be. So I'm in favor. 2 thumbs up for the path.
Andrew,
Just to add, yeah, I mean, the idea of a travel credential, whether it be health or anything else, that is aligned across the entire global industry feels a long way off. And although I think that's something that we should be looking at with new technologies and looking at standardizing some of that automation and digital travel credentials, whatever format they take, we should be aiming for that. But there's a bunch of stuff we can do quickly in the short term that can get us ready and get us ready for travel. And I guess one of my messages would be, between the airlines and airports and other colleagues, we're pretty expert in these areas, and we know how to move people. We're pretty good with logistics. So it would be, ask us, because it's not just about the triggers for government for when they are ready, but they need to understand the triggers for us to be ready to respond and be ready for that plan.
Great point.
Walt, what are your concerns about limiting interprovincial travel until we can get the virus under control? There's been so much dialogue about that. Sometimes we thought it would happen. What's your perspective on that?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that domestic travel is not the panacea for saving the tourism industry, with the odd exception on a per business or community level. We can't rely on domestic tourists to save the industry. The visitor spend is 3 to 5 times lower than international visitors. But at the same time, domestic visitors do represent a bridge to international travel, and that will at least allow many businesses to keep their doors open, even if only in a break-even proposition. There was a lot of talk a few weeks ago about banning visitation from other provinces, something that we opposed. We recognize the fears of residents, but we don't believe an outright ban is the route to go. In fact, I would say that the entire tourism and hospitality industry in BC has not been actively marketing to out-of-province visitors. In fact, we've supported provincial directives, even though the impact on our sector has been very devastating. And to us, health and safety has really become the #1 objective for any business that's open. But from our perspective, the travel sector has already been unfairly demonized in recent months, and the notion of a travel ban really fans people's fears, and it leads to this perception that travel is largely the cause of the spread, when in fact the data doesn't support it, and the government will even acknowledge that. The vast majority of transmission, as you know, has been in social settings. So what we need to do really is to figure out how to restore confidence in travel, We need to stop pitting residents against visitors. We really need to educate people that if they're planning to visit British Columbia for whatever purpose, whether it's non-essential or for work purposes, what have you, they need to abide by our health and safety protocols, including don't bother coming if you've tested positive, or if you don't feel well, don't get on the airplane, don't travel by car, stay at home until such time it's right for you to travel. But we just don't think that a travel ban is the route to go. It's really hard to police, as we know, but there are better ways of dealing with people who choose to vacation or to work in British Columbia.
The aviation industry, Serge, is central to shipping goods. Tell me how the pandemic has affected the shipment of goods, cargo to communities, even remote communities.
Well, I think, I mean, cargo for Air Canada anyway, that may, if there is a silver lining, and there are not a whole lot of them when I look back to the last year, but cargo is one at Air Canada. So we've always transported cargo in the belly of aircraft. So those wide body aircrafts allow you to put lobsters that are going to China typically, but we did not have a fully integrated cargo planes at Air Canada. We used to many years ago, but we had gotten out of that. And that's the one place where, even though on some routes, even though the number of passengers was not sufficient to say justify a scheduled service, the fact that we were transporting more cargo in the belly of those wide body aircraft allowed us to keep flying and keep pilots actually employed and maintenance people that look after those aircraft. And we also early on transformed 4 777 aircraft and 3 Airbus 330. So our wide body aircraft, we stripped all the seats. And so they became all cargo aircraft during this pandemic. So much so that since the beginning of the pandemic last March, we've operated probably over 4,000 cargo only flights at Air Canada. So that's been the silver lining. And we've also made the decision that we will transform some of our 767 into full freighter aircraft. So there's a bit of a difference here in terms of the modification of the aircraft, what kind of goods and how you put the goods into the aircraft. So based on the full freighters as opposed to the model we have right now, which is just removing the seats to put more cargo on board those aircraft. So that's number one. We had also started working with Drone Delivery Canada to start a drone delivery service. That was prior to the pandemic, but that was accelerated. There's still some regulatory steps to go over there, but there is no doubt though that when you lose the ability to go to a region and you lose that belly of the aircraft capacity, it has an impact on how quickly you can get these goods to those communities. Or if they can still get there by other means, the costs associated with that. So, and that is, that's why it's a broad ecosystem. It's a constellation of different ways. And when you look at our network map prior to and today, and I'm sure it's the same at WestJet and other airlines and what it is today, there are communities, we agree, that are suffering because of that, but we're in a fight for survival right now, and it's been painful internally, but it's also, and we recognize that it's been painful for a number of communities. So.
Heather, what is the international reputation of our airline industry? And then Andy from WestJet, will go to you.
Well, I can say when I was with NAV Canada, I sat on many international committees, including representatives from China, Japan, Russia, Iceland, all of what was the European Union at the time. And Canada always fares very, very well, highly respected, both from airport and the airline sector. Certainly, in the very, very top tier And safety standards for Canada are very, very high. And both our airlines and our airports always, shine through. So very, very well respected.
Andy from WestJet.
Can I be objective on this one? I don't know.
I want
Look,
you to be.
look, we have faced some challenges, and I think this is a really important question, because the history of transportation in Canada is that often most modes of transportation in this country have at some point been public services or crown corporations. So sometimes the culture around mass transportation is not entrepreneurial. It's not consistent with sort of WestJet's DNA. I think it is fundamentally mixed. I think Walt talked about a bit of this travel scapegoating, and I think the fact that many of our political leaders have really singled out travel as the activity you should not do, when airports and our aircraft may be some of the safest places you can actually be. I think they have had a part to play in that. I think we have some difficulty educating on our issues sometimes around refunds and other things that have had a negative impact on us. But then on the flip side, and I'm sure Serge and others on the panel will say the same thing, I think it's really brought to life the essential nature of our investments and also our relationship with communities. I think communities are really struggling with the fact that their post-secondary institution can't have effective academic exchanges and can't attract foreign students. And all of these issues that no one really thought of in good times as related to what investments an airline makes are now making those linkages. So, I think it is quite mixed. On the international side, we should be very proud of the fact Canada has we have multiple airlines and we have a great industry, and Heather's right. But Canada is unique in many ways to have two really strong global competitive network carriers. That's not true in other countries. We have one base in Western Canada and one base in Central Canada. And if you'll indulge me, I think it was 2005, I was at a conference in downtown Vancouver about open skies and air access issues challenging the province. And look where we are today. BC, prior to the pandemic, had never been more affordably connected to Canada and the world than it was in 2019. And full credit to Air Canada and the investments they've made, whether it's Delhi or some of these other critical investments. So, it's mixed, but the story in BC has been legitimately profound. Since those days where there was a lot of people in our sector who thought the answer to what ails BC can be found somewhere else. It can be found in China. It can be found in UAE. No, the answers are here. So I think, I think that's something to reflect on when we think about how we build back.
Walt, yes, Walt, I just wanted to ask you a question related to the cruise ship industry. If you can tell the audience what's happening with that industry in downtown Vancouver, and how that's affecting the aviation sector, and those two linkages.
Yeah, most definitely. As you know, cruise is upwards of a 2.7 billion industry for Metro Vancouver alone, close to 300 annual sailings. And of course, we lost the cruise sector last year completely. And this year, the same prospect, with the federal government announcing that any cruise ship with more than 100 passengers will not be allowed to sail within Canadian waters until February of 2022. Last year was devastating for the entire cruise ecosystem. You had large and small operators. When I talk about large, these are airlines that ferry a lot of cruise passengers into places like Vancouver and Victoria to be able to get on ships to enjoy their Alaska cruise. Minus that business, that also includes the hotels who regularly bring cruise passengers for at least one night in the city. And many of those people return for a vacation at some point because they've discovered Vancouver for the very first time. But in addition to that, you have all the people that service the cruise lines. You have all of the retailers, restaurants, attractions, all count on the the cruise sector for 6 months of the year that represents their peak season. Absent of cruise again this year, many of those businesses will fold. Some have already packed it in because they cannot rely on domestic visitation. So it's a huge blow. We actually sent a letter to the Prime Minister and several members of Cabinet recently suggesting, look, let's reconsider this ban, if only in 3-month increments, depending on what happens with herd immunity, the notion of digital passports, etc. Let's see if in fact we can see some cruise happening this year, potentially in the final quarter. There have been pilot projects, I'll call them pilot projects, they're not really, but there have been upwards of 400 cruises in different places around the world over the past few months. That's protocols, health and safety protocols, and they've worked. And so cruise has the means to do that. But here's another fear. There is an act that foreign owned and built ships and crewed ships need to, when they sail from the United States to another US port, stop in a foreign jurisdiction. So in our case, those ships coming up from Seattle must stop in either Victoria or Vancouver. There's a movement afoot in the US by lawmakers to not only suspend that for the time being so that Alaska can still have a cruise season, Seattle can also benefit as well. But my fear is that becomes permanent. What if the lobby gets stronger and they suggest to the US government, let's do away with this archaic law? It's a benefit to us right now. I'm not suggesting cruise lines will completely abandon Vancouver and Victoria, because there's lots of advantages to sailing from our jurisdiction versus Seattle. But just when you face that prospect, you think about upwards of $4 billion in economic impact out of the province of BC, not to mention the other downstream benefits that we've enjoyed previously.
Andy from YVR, you know, when we're traveling out of your airport, also from the Abbotsford International Airport, it's an experience, you know, whether you're traveling for business or for leisure, you know, you're in that Air Canada, WestJet or WestJet terminal. How are you, as an airport designer, going to ensure that it's still an experience, a positive experience, knowing that we still need rapid testing technology, knowing that, you know, PPE is so important, you know, all of these other measures around health and safety. How are you going to reinvent the airport, so to speak, at YVR?
Well, I'm not sure we're going to reinvent too much, because we're already doing a huge amount of work in this area. And you know, we've approached this in a very similar way to the introduction of security protocols and things like that. There's no one thing that fixes everything. There's no one thing that will be the right thing for every airport. So it's a layered approach, right? You've got to build confidence in how passengers travel through the airport. Our experience at YVR, I think, is one of our attractions. People talk about the experience at YVR, the look and feel of the airport. People love the sense of place that you have when you come to YVR. So I'm not sure we're going to mess around too much with that side of the customer experience, but we are looking at different ways to make the most out of our revenue streams. We've had a very static model when it comes to revenue for a long period of time, where you funnel people through security, then you funnel them through duty free, and then off they go to their gates and off onto the aircraft. So we are starting to look at other innovative ways to tailor customer experience more directly to the passengers' individual needs, whether that's food to gate deliveries or different types of revenue experiences you can bring into the airport. That's something that we're looking at for now, but also in recovery as well, because I think people's wants and needs will be far less about contact points and far more about a streamlined journey through the airport and onto the aircraft. So we're looking at how we can make sure that environment exists for when passengers come back. But our huge focus at the moment, as I said before, is on safety. We've got a real layered safety approach. We control access to the airports in this time where we've got essential travel only. So the only people entering the building are people who work here and those people who are traveling. We've got temperature screening, physical distancing where appropriate. We have compulsory face mask policy in the airport. Counters have plexiglass between every transaction, so between the staff and the customers. We've got that through security as well. We've moved our cleaning and enhanced our cleaning. We've got more cleaning techniques in the airport than I've ever seen in my life, from electrostatic sprayers to more regular cleaning. And we've moved it from a out of sight, out of mind model to a high visible model that happens during the day. We've got robot cleaners, we've got UV lights, and all of these types of things. Just they are very effective cleaning techniques, but they're also about ensuring that customers feel happy and secure as they start to move through our airport. So I would say tailoring revenue experiences to the passengers' needs, and ensuring people really understand this is one of the safest modes of travel. That's where our focus is at the moment.
Thank you. So Serge from Air Canada and Andy from WestJet, I just wanted to ask you, related to the federal government's wage subsidy program, critics have indicated that both airlines have received wage subsidies. So why are they laying off staff? And are you going to be able to bring them back to work when things start recovering in terms of the vaccination program? So Serge, we'll go to you first from Air Canada.
Yeah, I mean, the wage subsidy has been, it's been an important lifeline for a lot of our employees. And we have taken the wage subsidy. But, we've, even though we're operating at about 10% of our capacity, we've kept 50% of our employees. So the wage subsidy has been very, very useful for that. But nonetheless, the airline business is a capital intensive business. Every time, every day, we have fixed costs that are fairly significant. That's why the cash burn is what it is, even though we took all the measures that we did, and even though we did take the wage subsidy. So for Air Canada, for example, the total amount of wage subsidies that we've received from the federal government represents about a month of cash burn since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's been useful, but it's not been the panacea of keeping this airline afloat. We've used other means to keep ourselves afloat since the beginning of the pandemic, meaning we've raised liquidities ourselves through different means. So helpful, but again, it has helped us keep employees furloughed. We don't have work for them, but we've kept them furloughed so we can recall them quickly. But we've kept, as I said, more people furloughed and even on the payroll than just the size of our operations right now would typically justify.
Andy from WestJet.
Not very different. I'll be quick. Wage subsidy is a very valuable program. We asked for it to be extended. If you know any WestJetters, you know how passionate they are about their company. They want to continue to remain tied to it. So it's been valuable in that respect, but let's not confuse it for an industry support package of any global stature or significance. It's not what it was designed for at all, and it is not in that category. And with respect to liquidity support, it has been the priority for our company, and we've been public about this. It really is fixing the demand side of our business and bringing that consistency to domestic and international travel more than it has been a loan or a support to our bottom line. It has been those measures that benefit everybody versus a solution that benefits our company.
My final question or statement to all of you, and Heather, we're going to start with you, is air travel in Canada is not structured by the government to be an economic enabler. Rather, it's treated as a source for public revenue. The result of this is that the Canadian air travel industry is not well positioned to compete in the future of an increasingly globally economic, very competitive air market. Do you agree with that statement? And what are your comments and perspectives? Heather.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. And I think, as was stated before by Andy from WestJet, that Canada is somewhat unique in that most of our transportation, modes of transportation either are or have been inside the government, inside a government agency. And certainly Transport Canada operates now as the regulator for air. But that being said, that's true. It has never been looked at as an economic driver as much as most people in the sector, from tourism to the airlines to the airports, will come out to say this is an economic driver and for our country, our provinces and our country. But the government has never really looked at it that way to support it in that manner. So I agree. Having spent 35 years in the aviation industry and started out as an employee of the government, it's not much different now that it isn't highly inside the government. So I do agree that we are slipping behind, especially during this time in the pandemic, because we are not positioning ourselves to be ready to go. So there's some challenges there for sure.
Thank you, Heather. So Walt, your perspective, and then Andy from YVR.
Well, I would agree with Heather. I think when you look at the number of charges that an air passenger pays that are factored in to the cost of the ticket, that would tell you right there that government isn't supplying those services and thinking in terms of an economic generator. It's a way to offset the cost of those services, perhaps. And there's a subtle difference there, but it really kind of shows the ideology behind it. So if you look at charges for navigation systems, the air traveler security charge, airport rents, et cetera, you add all those up. And I think the last study that I saw showed that Canada, in terms of competitiveness, was about 130 out of 138 countries. When you factor in all of those charges, et cetera. I may have that a bit off, and my airline partners here can correct me, but in terms of being competitive, we're just not there, and that's a consequence of all those charges. It also reminds me too that it wasn't more than a few years ago, the federal government was looking at selling off some of the airports across the country. Fortunately, that's died down, but when you think of it in those terms, that's not thinking about airports as a community service and an economic generator. It's really trying to look at the public treasury and saying, how can we maximize what we get by selling these community operations and generating dollars to the bottom line. As I say, fortunately, that hasn't gone anywhere, and hopefully it won't. But when you have community-run airports like YVR, for example, it's about economic generation. It's about making sure that the community at large benefits. It's not only about people traveling back and forth. And that's really the model or the ideology that government needs to think about. These are absolutely vital. And as I alluded to earlier, when I talked about airlines being the currency, we absolutely need airports to be economic generators in our industry and for others as well.
Andy from YVR, and then Andy from WestJet.
Oh yeah, no, I'd agree and echo lots of the comments. It may not have been seen as an economic enabler, but I think everyone on this call and this panel could state quite clearly that it is. Like, you know, and just for the fact that the traffic has dried up and the impact it's had on everyone's businesses and the environment here in BC, it's absolutely a key enabler to the recovery and the restart of our economy. So much so that for us as YVR, one of our strategic pillars for this year is called Gateway to the New Economy. And it is about, we aren't an airport for the sake of being an airport. We're an airport to facilitate the movement of goods and people for the benefit of the economy that we serve. So that's very much how we look at our position within our environment. So it does need to be looked at like that. And, we need support for industry wide, and when to the question, where is it making it increasingly hard for us to be competitive. I think there's a question that we need to ask. When you look at our US counterparts and the investment that's happened in the US for airports and airlines, I would say pre-COVID, from a service and quality of airlines and for a transiting passenger through our airports, we were very competitive. We have some pretty good processes. We're very ahead of our US counterparts in that area, but we need to make sure that we are when we recover as well. And part of that is looking at us as a key economic enabler and making sure the investments are done at the right time so that we can recover and be ahead of the game and attract all of that business back to BC and Canada as a whole.
Andy from WestJet, and then Serge.
That was such a great question. Full kudos and hat tip to whoever put that one together. Going to be hard to keep my comments very short, but I will try, I promise. Aviation is unique because it is a user pay model. When you land at YVR, you have to tap your visa. There is a user pay for border services. There is a user pay for the facility. And BC has to compete with Washington State. Parm-Sidhu and Abbotsford is competing with that airport directly across the border. So cost competitiveness benchmarking is going to be essential for the province and for the country. And we are very concerned about the affordability of air travel when we come out of the pandemic. I don't mean this as disrespect to NAV Canada, but NAV Canada was forced to increase their rates by 30%. That is passed on to travelers. Airports across the country have been forced to increase their AIFs. And again, I'm not criticizing these organizations. I'm just saying these decisions will price consumers out of the market. They will price families out of the market. And so, cost competitiveness benchmarking is really critical. And, we've raised this issue every year since we've existed. And the answer has always been, why are you complaining about this? Aviation's never been better. And that's true. If you're a politician and this issue was brought to you in 2019, you'd say, hey, WestJet, every airport in British Columbia has had a record year. What's the problem? We have a different circumstance now. The challenge before us is to rebuild our industry and to not just preserve service like we're a crown corporation, but to preserve competition and maintain British Columbia's competitive advantage. And that's really at stake. So, thank you to whoever asked that question. One final thought. In 2018, which was the last full year that we were publicly traded, our profit per guest was, I used to say it was the price of a Big Mac combo. So every flight you were on, you could look at the guests, and it's Vancouver. Maybe I should say it's a nigiri lunch plate. But the point is, it's a very tight margin business. So every dollar does make a difference. And we're very concerned about how we emerge from this. Thanks for that question.
And Serge from Air Canada, you have the last word.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it goes back a number of years. Some of you will probably remember because he was an MP for the region, but David Emerson had been tasked with doing a report for the federal government a number of years ago. It was 2015, I believe. And in that, there was a number of different recommendations that touch on a number of sectors of transportation. But on aviation, a key number of recommendation was actually to address the cost structure imposed on airlines, but really imposed on passengers and what it means for economic recovery or economic, as an economic enabler of this industry. The government has acted on a number of recommendations around that report, except for the cost recommendations. And the gap with our neighbors to the south is growing even more so day to day, especially now that not only the airlines, but the airports in the United States has received billions of dollars in direct dollars from their national government. And our airports are competing with that. Parm is competing with that. Andy at YVR is competing with that. So that will have to be addressed as we look at the restart, because those tourists around the world that will want to come and spend their hard-earned dollars here in BC, cost is always a factor. From 1970, Canada was #2 in terms of inbound tourists, international visitors. By 2012, the last year I have numbers, we were down to number 16, and it's because of the cost of travel into Canada because of all those charges and fees and this and that. So it absolutely need to be addressed going forward. It needed to be addressed prior to the pandemic, more so today, to make sure that we can actually continue to play the role, that our airports can continue to play the role that they play in the economy of our province.
Thank you so much, everyone, to our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to remind you that Surrey is an opportunity city, and we are there for the aviation and aerospace industry sector, ensuring we're instigating change and action. And I just also wanted to remind you to check out all of our services and our events at businessinsurrey.com.